Welcome to Cultivate 2020, our technical issue on digging in. Today we'll be discussing algae mitigation. Hello, my name is Daniel Norton, and I'm the Senior Technical and R&D Manager for Horticulture here at Profile Products. And thanks for joining us today. So, surface algae, big problem in greenhouses. It's a problem on containers. It's also a problem on walkways as well as different surfaces in the greenhouse. It can be a breeding ground for unwanted pests. Usually the presence of algae is caused by an overabundance of moisture, which can also lead to shore fly as well as fungus gnat populations. It can also trap moisture from reaching the plant. And the way that it does this is that, if the algae, which you can see very clearly in this image, is green, and so you know that it's there. And sometimes when you move these plants out of a high moisture environment, let's say that these were direct stock, you reduce the moisture during irrigation, and this algae will form a crust and it will die off. And that can become like a very hydrophobic crust that can hinder water from penetrating to the lower level of the container. It can also rob the plants of nutrients. It feeds off of the same fertilizer that your plants do. It can also stall plant growth. And it can also spill over into walkways, which can also be a safety hazard for your employees. And these are just images of plants that we've come across in the field, growing in mixtures of hydrofiber, algae issues. We tend to see algae problems most prominently in vegetative liner production. This is because we need a lot of moisture to keep the plants turgid until they develop roots and they root out into the substrate. You can in their cuttings that there's a shiny green surface. That's usually a good indicator of excessive moisture content. So this is certainly something that we want to avoid. This example are the plant that's on the right-hand side is also, as you can tell from the green surface, has a lot of surface algae in it. In direct stick programs, which a lot of our grower customers are starting to do for both chrysanthemums as well as poinsettias, this can be a problem. And that's because you have a lot of soil surface exposed until that plant can get large enough to shade out the algae that's below it on the soil surface. So again, it can be a challenge because, it's, again, like on the previous slide, until we have roots in the root ball to where it can take up water itself, we have to keep those plants turgid. And it really doesn't matter what type of growing media you use, whether you're using a peat hydrofiber mix or a core hydrofiber mix or a peat perlite or bark and peat mix. Algae is a problem on all of these mix types. It also doesn't really matter what type of crops you're growing, whether you're growing primulas, hostas, or even dianthus. Algae can be an issue. So let's talk about some keys to success that we recommend, not just for hydrofiber, for all mixes in general. So first and foremost, it's important to manage your irrigation. So if you're a grower that is making your own substrates on your mixing line, it's definitely important to make sure you have the right amount of moisture going into the mix at the time of blending. We've talked on some other webinar series the importance of getting the moisture content up to about 60 to 65% at the time of blending. However, some growers make the mistake of going too wet, and therefore you've got a lot of moisture that's in the pot that's not necessary for the plant at the time of blending, and it makes it a lot harder to control because you don't have roots that are well established, and they're not going to pull up the water into the plant and transpire it through the foliage. And so you don't want to set yourself up early on in production by overwetting the mix. It's also important to make sure that you have the right amount of water coming out of your mist system, especially in propagation. And a lot of growers, what they talk to their growers about doing is that you want enough mist just to barely to the point of runoff coming off the foliage, especially during propagation. It's important to periodically make sure that you clean out your irrigation lines as well as your mist nozzles, because algae can form, as well as other biofilms. It's also important to make sure that you clean under your benches, because the excess water can fall down onto the floor. If you have concrete or gutter, algae can form, which can also create a another area or breeding ground for short fly or fungus gnats. The other thing too that's actually interesting, I'll talk to in a moment, is managing excess iron in your irrigation water as well as your substrate. Because there's been some research that has shown that algae presence is highly correlated with iron. And there's a number of chemical controls that we recommend that growers use. One chemical that a lot of our growers say they have a lot of success with is Clean Grow. There's another form called Uptake, which some growers are using as well. I believe they're the same chemical. A lot of growers really like this product in particular. Xerotal is also used by a number of our grower customers. The one comment about Clean Grow that I would make that many of our customers have mentioned is that it's much better when used as a preventative as opposed to a curative. So a couple of things to keep an eye out for. I mentioned the shiny surface. Look for fungus activity, excuse me. If you see fungus gnats up on foliage, and chances are there's standing water somewhere or a very wet, humid environment. Also, excess moisture that's on the leaf. So I made reference on the previous slide to some work that's been done. This was done by Jim Faust and Laura Signoretti. I think it was, I believe, in 2012. And basically, they were looking at what kind of nutrients lead to the presence of algae. And the one common theme that they found when they looked at this was iron. And so in this slide, they basically looked at iron concentrations ranging from 0 to 5 parts per million. And as you can see, there's no algae in the 0 parts per million, whereas even as little as 0.3 parts per million, you can see where there's algae starting to form. So again, plants need iron, just like algae does. So we can't say, well, just reduce the amount of iron that you're using, but definitely look at your feed strategy as well as your irrigation water changes that are could be had if you've got too much iron. So let's summarize what we learned today. Initial moisture is key. So plants have not established themselves in pots immediately after planting. So why put more water in that container than you need? So it's definitely a balancing act. It's important that if you're blending your own substrates, to aim for 60-65% moisture content coming off your mixing line, and then do not overwater in when you put them into the greenhouse. Make sure that you water them just enough to keep the plants going. Manage excess moisture in production. So it's important to evaluate your mist frequency as well as pulse times, particularly in propagation, because this is where most algae problems tend to rear their head. Start clean, end clean. So by keeping your floors free of plant debris, that will help reduce the amount of algae growth, as well as making sure that you clean up in between crops. Clean your irrigation lines often with proper chemical controls. Also, if there's opportunities to evaluate the iron concentration in your irrigation water, your fertilizer program, even your soil, that may also help to reduce algae as a problem in your mix. And then lastly, look at chemical controls. Clean Grow, again, is one of the ones that many of our growers have had success with, but Xerotal also has been widely used. And there's a variety of others out there, but these seem to be the two main ones that many of our customers are using. Well, and that's it for today on algae control and hydrofiber. If there's any questions, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions that you may have. And if you do not have any, we'd be happy to take any questions at a later time at either our website at hydrofiber.com, at the phone number here, or email address supplied on the slide. Thank you very much.